An initiate poured black ash into a cracked obsidian hourglass while the prophet raised his hand and the acolytes chanted. Suspicion tightened the researcher's jaw as he later transcribed the ritual. He had seen hints of fraud before, but never a rite that celebrated destruction. The immediate problem was clear. This order did not avert apocalypse, it sanctified it. The researcher wanted to know how worship of annihilation became formal doctrine and which instruments, manipulation, staged omens, or sincere belief had built that doctrine into reality. The chamber smelled of wet ash and old oil. Torches guttered against stone. The initiate's hands trembled as she tipped the funnel. Ash hissed and settled into the lower bulb. Acolytes tightened the circle. The prophet's voice rose and fell in a cadence meant to erase hesitation. The researcher recorded each measured detail in his notebook later, pen tapping the page as if testing the tempo of what he'd heard. He left the sanctum with a single fact. The order used physical ceremonies to convert terror into ritual. That fact guided every choice he made that night. He moved from the sanctum to his study without sleep. He catalogued the chant, he wrote the chant's line breaks, and the exact places where the initiate had faltered. He circled words that matched marginal notes in older fragments. At the study table he held the initiate's testimony. She sat across from him, rubbing her wrist where a thin ritual mark still showed. "I thought it would stop," she said. "I thought the ash would keep it from coming." The researcher repeated her words into the recorder. "Why ash?" He asked, "Why an hourglass?" The initiate answered in a voice that stumbled between relief and fear. Here's time itself was the sacrifice. Her mouth trembled. The researcher smelled sweat and cheap incense and felt the weight of an urgent question building. Who supplied that image, and why did it persuade so many people to accept annihilation as salvation? He planned the next day. He needed a relic and an outsider's eye. At dawn he met Marta Voss, the local antiquarian, at the ruined chapel where a half-buried fragment had been reported. Marta kept her hair in a tight knot and wore leather gloves. She knelt in the sand and brushed with a small brush until the sigil on the hourglass shard revealed itself. A looped glyph with a scratched annotation in a different hand. "This isn't a devotional mark, Marta," tapping the annotation with a bone folder. "This is editorializing. Someone added dates here to sync the rite with weather events." The researcher felt a shift from mere suspicion to active doubt about the prophet's authenticity. They argued over what the annotation meant. The researcher probed, and Marta pushed back. "You read everything as conclusive," she said. "You and your ledger will see plots where there are scribes and restorers." "Scribes who change dates to produce panic are not restorers," the researcher shot back. Their voices rose in a cramped vestibule where pigeons had nested in broken eaves. The argument ended with Marta rubbing her knuckles and agreeing to search municipal ledgers for matching payments and entries. The researcher walked away with two things: a fragment of the hourglass sigil and Marta's promise to look for irregular entries tied to the order. That afternoon the researcher met an old custodian, Elias, who had managed the chapel records. Elias smelled of linseed oil and tobacco. He produced a packet of receipts and a small leather-bound journal kept by the chapel steward. "We kept odd payments here for repairs," Elias, opening the journal to a page full of entries in a cramped hand. He pointed to two lines where sums were delivered on nights of storms and then labeled "Omen Confirmation." Marta frowned. "Someone paid to make omens look true," she said. The researcher wrote the words into his notebook and then read them aloud. He heard his own suspicion changing shape. Doubt tightened into an image of orchestration. The ledger suggested someone had bought weather reports, saboteurs, and falsified signs to anchor belief. He felt the first emotion shift, suspicion, doubt. The notebook pages multiplied under his hand. The act of writing made the problem tangible. That night in a safe house the researcher questioned an acolyte who had broken under pressure. The room smelled of damp cloth and soap. The acolyte's voice was small. She kept her eyes down. "He us the hourglass counted the world's sins," she said. "He us our hands could tip time." "I believed it because everyone else did." The researcher leaned forward and touched the thin ritual mark on her wrist through the sleeve. He for the ritual stages, and she listed them plainly. Oath, isolation, staged omens, the ash hourglass. "He gave us terms for sacrifice and then showed us the terms played out," she said. The researcher pressed for specifics. "Who arranged the omens?" he asked. The acolytes swallowed people from the town, payments. A boat with crates that arrived 2 nights before the so called comet. The researcher wrote the word payments in the ledger of his notes and felt the second emotion shift, doubt, disquiet. He realized the prophet might be less a mystical seer and more an engineer of belief. A new event occurred every few pages of notes. Marta called with a record of municipal ledgers showing a series of anonymous donations tied to chapel maintenance on the dates the prophet had declared sacred. The researcher arranged a meeting with the steward, Rowan, who managed the prophet's private chest. Rowan came in late, pale and reluctant, bearing a small key in a folded cloth. In the prophet's private chamber, the researcher and Rowan moved slowly. The chest was bound in iron and smelled faintly of smoke. Rowan's hands shook as he fitted the key. They found inside a small ledger with neat columns. Names, sums, and terse annotations, storm arranged, a bridge collapser, false comet. The researcher read the annotations aloud. "This is a list of operations," he said. Rowan refused to meet his eyes. He had served revelation, Rowan whispered. He the end must be willing. The room closed around that phrase, and the researcher's skepticism hardened into a new certainty. Orchestration. The ledger supplied a twist. On one page there was a payment listed to the relic custodian, an old partner of the prophet, followed by a marginal note in the prophet's hand. In sure spectacle near crossing. The researcher traced the handwriting with a fingertip. He thought of the initiate's fumble pouring ash into glass. He thought of Marta's annotation about manipulated dates. He thought of Alias's receipts. The hidden pattern rose into view. The prophet purchased events. That revelation changed the narrative shape. It moved the story from possible delusion to deliberate deception. Rowan argued in clipped sentences, "You don't understand power in the order," he said. "People took it as miracle because they needed miracle." Rowan, the researcher, replied, "Miracles bought with coin are frauds." "You were part of that accounting." Rowan's throat worked. "We kept the order together. He kept the peace. He the end would save us." The researcher remained still. He catalogued Rowan's confession in the ledger and recorded the steward's decisions as evidence of complicity rather than merely obedience. The researcher realized that the pathway from belief to violence had defined ceremonial escalation. He mapped it in the margin of his notes. Isolation rituals lowered resistance. Staged omens increased fear. Financial pressure tied villagers to the order through need. And the hourglass ritual gave a tangible object to the promise of release. He marked each step and linked it to the ledger entries. The process looked engineered. He felt an emotion shift as clarity began to replace dark unease, disquiet clarity. He returned to the safe house at midnight to interview one of the acolytes who had broken. The acolyte's hands fumbled on the table. She spoke quickly. "We were told to test devotion with small losses," she said. "Then the sacrifices grew." The researcher wrote the phrase, "small losses," and circled it. The acolyte added, "Us suffering would burn the old world away." People felt relief when something broke. Relief turned to hunger for the next sign. The researcher watched the acolyte's throat bob. He noted the way she glanced toward the wardrobe where a pair of ceremonial robes lay folded. 3 paragraphs later, an event forced the researcher out into the night. A messenger arrived with an anonymous note. "Do not open the chest alone." The note changed the immediate plan. The researcher closed his notebook and set a trap. He called Marta and Rowan to meet at dawn at the ruined altar. The mini cliffhanger created a new tension. Someone else watched them. At the ruined altar under a washed sky, the prophet returned with a small group of acolytes. Moonlight pooled in fallen stone. The researcher crouched behind a collapsed column and watched the prophet raise the bronze staff. The prophet spoke to the crowd in a voice that climbed into fervor. "Time is our offering," he said. "We cut the cord that binds us to this world." The researcher recorded the exact cadence and the timing of each line. He had the ledger in a satchel beneath his coat. The confrontation began when the prophet's gaze swept the ruined courtyard and locked onto the researcher. "You've been digging," the prophet, as if stating a fact. "You should not have come here." The researcher stepped forward. "Rowan provided me your ledger," he said. "You paid to stage omens. You bought fear." Acolytes moved like a single organism. The prophet's voice changed to a rasp. "Rowan betrayed us," he said. "He has no right to speak of sacrifice." Voices rose. "You lied," Rowan shouted. You kept the books that fed the village lies a rapid back, and forth followed Rowan. The prophet hissed, "You pocketed coin meant for the feast. You pocketed truth meant for the people." Rowan fired back. "You paid men to start fires and then pretended to douse them." "Silence, the prophet. You will not turn the faithful from their path. You will not turn the faithful into corpses," Rowan replied. The exchange was 6 lines long, and jagged acolytes closed ranks. The researcher felt hands on his shoulders. He resisted instinct to flee, and instead moved to seize the ledger. The prophet lunged for the chest. Steel flashed. The researcher shoved Rowan toward the broken steps. Acolytes grabbed at sleeves. The initiate, who had fled earlier and returned with a small sack, stumbled into the scuffle. She reached for the hourglass. Her fingers were shaking. The researcher grabbed the ledger with his free hand. Acolytes cried out. The clash turned violent in a way that left bare bones and splintered altar stones. In the chaos, the initiate made a choice. She slammed her elbow into the hourglass, and the cracked obsidian bulb shattered. Glass rained and black ash showered the courtyard. People coughed. The prophet's face streaked with ash. For a moment the congregation wavered. The researcher saw a line in Rowan's ledger where the prophet had annotated, "Final spectacle." Hourglass full. The researcher understood the act's consequence. By destroying the hourglass, the initiate removed the central symbol the prophet used to convert fear into sacrament. The scuffle became flight. The researcher pulled Rowan toward the rear passage. Marta had that night arrived with 2 villagers and began shouting the facts she had found about municipal payments. She held up copies of receipts. "Look," she cried, "look at these entries. The order paid for storms, purposely broken bridges, timed fires. Look at the dates." Her voice cut through chants and panic. The crowd's pulse shifted from controlled fervor to confusion and then to anger. Someone shouted the prophet's name as a liar. Others shouted for arms. They fled through a narrow lane. The researcher carried the ledger, but the weight of it was not mere leather. It carried motive written in numbers. Rowan limped on a wound to his calf. The initiate stumbled and then ran, leaving a smear of ash on a wall. The researcher did not speak much. He catalogued each sound, each shout, and the way the prophet's followers split into those who ran and those who stood still with masked fury. Back in the study at dawn, the researcher spread the ledger on his table and photographed each page. He taped each torn edge and wrote transcriptions beside each entry. The physical labor of re-binding the ledger grounded him. He checked the signatures. He matched Rowan's handwriting to entries and matched a second hand to notes that must have belonged to the prophet. He felt no abstract relief. He felt the concrete relief of evidence in his palm. He also felt a residual unease. The prophet had been more than an organizer. He had charisma. He had convinced entire households to surrender property, to offer children as acolytes, to trade savings for ritual needs. The ledger showed money moving into pockets, and the archives showed dates manipulated. But who else benefited? The researcher traced names and found they matched local officials, merchants, and 2 ship captains who had carried crates of fabricated signs in the months before a declared omen. Marta returned with copies of municipal payments and a name that did not fit. Isaac Garin, a merchant known for grain shipments. The researcher found a line in the ledger that listed Isaac's payment labeled "crowd noise and misplaced sales." He called Elias and asked where Isaac had been on the night the so-called comet appeared. Elias hesitated and then provided an alibi built on a port ledger and a note indicating a paid diversion. The pattern widened. The researcher saw a network. Not only an individual prophet, but a small machine of actors who profited from fear. He wrote his findings into a draft report that evening. He composed short sentences so that his voice would read without stumbling. He inserted direct quotations from Rowan, Marta, the acolyte, and the initiate. The researcher used names and actions often so listeners could track who spoke and why. He avoided generalizations. When he wrote the prophet's motive, he used a transcription of the prophet's own annotated page. "Ensure spectacle near crossing," a phrase that moved the accusation from vague motive to documented plan. An unexpected reveal arrived in the margin of the ledger. A notation indicating a payment to a distant order with similar rites. The researcher froze over the ink. The ledger suggested that the prophet did not invent the hourglass ritual, but had adapted it from a network of orders. This new twist reframed the prophet not as an isolated fraud, but as part of a chain that spread a doctrine by selling spectacles and staging crises. The discovery changed the scope of the case. It turned what had been a local scandal into a network investigation. Anger rose in Rowan when the researcher read the notation aloud. Those orders were brothers, Rowan muttered. They shared methods so the people would not be alone in the final hour. Rowan's hands slammed the table. The researcher wrote down Rowan's exact phrase and then asked quietly, "Did you ever doubt him when he said that?" Rowan's voice broke. "Sometimes I did," he said, "but he kept us safe from bandits. People paid for protection and were grateful. I told myself the ends justified the means." Rowan stared at his folded hands. The researcher's notes recorded the steward's moral calculation like a ledger of its own. The chapter's climax had been the ruined altar confrontation and the hourglass's destruction. The immediate conflict resolved. The ritual collapsed and evidence fled the prophet's control. Yet the researcher ended the night knowing the ledger had opened a bigger door. The network notation meant other orders might use the same model. Manufacture omens, buy spectacle, and sanctify annihilation. He finished the night cataloging names he could follow next: Isaac Garin, 2 ship captains, and a city scribe who had overseen municipal entries. He sealed the ledger in a cloth and placed it in a small chest beneath the study table. He had one final entry to write. He described the initiate's act. How she had slammed the hourglass, and how glass and ash scattered across the altar. He recorded the exact sentence she had spoken as she broke it. "I won't give him the proof." He logged the line so the moment remained concrete. The researcher paused and checked his recorder. He had mapped ritual stages, exposed payments, and traced a network. He had forced a rupture in the prophet's spectacle. He had not yet closed the case. The ledger named other nodes. The next step would require subpoenas and cautious public disclosure. He reached for the small brass pendant he carried and set it beside the ledger. He heard then a sharp, measured knock on the study door. He set the chest upright, slid the ledger inside, and closed the lid, fingers still hovering when the knock came again. He did not open. He wrote, in the margin of his notes, the time of the knock. The chapter ends with that knock. It is a concrete event tied to the evidence. Someone had come for the ledger or to warn them. The researcher sits with his hand on the chest, and the sound fades into the first pale light at the window. Emotion roots, suspicion, emotion shifts, suspicion, doubt, disquiet, clarity. He levered the rusted chest lid, and a smear of dark ash slapped across the flagstones. Suspicion tightened his jaw when the leather straps came away and a folded page slid free, the corner damp with old blood. The occult researcher crouched, breath shallow, and unfolded the map by candlelight. A township name had been circled in a handwriting he recognized from the ledger fragments he'd copied before. The immediate problem lay plain. The cult's intent was not hidden anymore. Within 5 lines of scrawled script, a public place and a date appeared. He set the map against the ledger and felt the pattern complete and terrible enough to act on. He had not come to the monastery for theater. He had come because the first chapter of evidence, an initiating ritual he had seen earlier, kept returning to him in detail. A shaken acolyte tipping dark powder into an hourglass while the prophet raised his hand. That image steered his choices now. He moved methodically. He checked the ledger for signatures, watched the candle flame for drafts, and wrapped the map in oilcloth. He was 45, lean and precise. He checked his spectacles for smear, and then eased the chest lid back to see if anything else lay hidden beneath the straw. A knock at the monastery archive door made him freeze. He did not answer. He counted the knocks slow, then a soft scrape as boots retreated. He took the ledger and the map and left through the cloister where pigeons had nested on the broken ledge. On the walk back to the lodging he rehearsed what he would say and what he would not say. Suspicion moved into doubt as he considered the ledger's names. Doubt seeded a different concern. If that the prophet had allies in the township, a public ritual would not be a chaotic explosion of fanatics. It would be permitted, planned, and protected. At the lodging, the initiate was waiting with hands folded on the table and eyes that did not look up until the researcher set the map down. The initiate's shirt smelled of damp cloth and cheap incense. "You found something?" The initiate, voice thin. "You led me to the chest," the researcher replied, naming the action. "Who marked the township?" The initiate's fingers went to the braided cord at his waist. He looked smaller than the ledger made him feel. I did not mark it alone, he admitted. I swore I would not tell. But I could not watch the hourglass break a town apart. Who gave the order? The researcher asked. The prophet, the initiate, the ceremony must be public, that the hourglass must be broken where people gather. Across the next hour, the researcher pressed the initiate with facts and fragments. He laid out ledger lines and asked the initiate to place names beside them. The initiate fumbled, then spoke in a rush. There is an ally in the township council. He writes permits, he silences guards, he signs the chapel leases. His name is Corbin. The researcher paused, then asked, Corbin. Last name. Corbin Valen, the initiate, he signs in brown ink. He wears a ring with a tiny crescent mark. He is usually at the tavern office on market mornings. The lettered certainty in the initiate's voice shifted the researcher's doubt into dread. He thought of the ledger's entries that listed civic offices next to ritual times. He thought of the way the prophet had spoken in that subterranean sanctum, calm, certain. He took out his notebook and began to write names, times, and a plan to verify Corbin Valen's presence at City Hall on market day. He would not accuse without proof. He would not act without a partner who understood law and talk. He made a list and then stopped himself from saying it aloud. That night the researcher followed the initiate's instructions and found the tavern office on a grey morning. Corbin Valen sat behind a low counter, neck thick with city seals, a half-eaten loaf beside his elbow. He wore a bronze ring with a crescent, and he signed documents with a brown ink pen. The researcher watched him sign a permit for repairs to the chapel ruins and slide the paper into a drawer labeled Public Records. The researcher photographed the permit from the street and tucked the image into his case. He confronted the initiate in the back room of the tavern before noon. Corbin's steps echoed as someone below locked iron shutters for an afternoon. You me where to look, the researcher said. You me about Corbin Valen. The initiate's mouth was tight. He is needed, he said. Corbin keeps the watchman away when the prophet asks. Corbin is promised a place when the town is reborn. Promised what? The researcher asked. Control. The initiate, he will manage the colony after. The prophet named him. The word colony landed with a physical thud in the researcher's chest. He set the map face up on the table and traced the circled township with a calloused finger. Then this is institutional, he said. This is not only zealotry. This is policy. The initiate nodded, voice creaking. I thought it would be mercy. I thought the flames would prune the rot. You thought you would be saved. The researcher asked. We were told we would be purified. The initiate, we were told to welcome it. A pause followed. The initiate placed his palm on the table, and his fingers trembled. He could not keep pretending. He pushed a folded scrap of paper across to the researcher. A partial copy of the prophet's assignments and a name circled in the margin. Look, the initiate, he has placed someone in the guardhouse. He will pull them away the night of the event. Who did you name? The researcher asked. Rafe. The initiate, Rafe signed the guard roster. He owes Corbin a debt. The researcher wrote the name down. He left the tavern with the initiate trailing behind like a shadow. On the lane the initiate whispered, I can stop it. I can remove the hourglass. I tried once. You will show me where? The researcher asked. They went to the ruined chapel at dawn, when light was thin and mortar flakes still clung to the stones. The hourglass sat inside a carved niche half, buried in dust. It glinted black where it had been repaired with dark resin. Its crack ran like a seam from the neck to the base. The initiate moved with quick, nervous motions, hands gloved in faded linen. He reached for the hourglass and a loyal acolyte emerged from the shadows, boots whispering on broken tile. Stop, the acolyte said. You will not touch the prophet's sign. His voice was plain without malice, and he held a short iron rod across his palms. The initiate's fingers flicked the braid at his waist. Rafe is supposed to be on duty. The initiate, where is he? The acolyte glanced toward the rear corridor, not him. Corbin pulled him for repairs. He leaves a hole in the roster tonight. The initiate lunged anyway. He shoved past the acolyte and grabbed the hourglass with both hands. The glass did not hold his grip. The acolyte shoved back. They scuffled among the glyph, carved floor stones, dust rose, and a winged gargoyle's mouth collected grit. The researcher burst through the chapel doorway at that moment, breath heaving from the run. Stop. He shouted, and his voice cut through the scuffle. "Stop, both of you!" They froze. The initiate had the hourglass at his chest. The acolyte's rod hovered. The researcher stepped between them, palms up. "You will not break it here," he said. "You will not set a public place as the altar of destruction." The initiate's jaw worked. "He will make it holy here in Market Square," he said. "He says the hourglass must break where people gather. Then we remove it now, quietly." The researcher said, "We take it outside of town and hide it. Or we expose Corbin's permit. But we do not let you break it like a cure." The acolyte spat a string of words and lunged. The iron rod hit the hourglass. A hairline fracture widened. For a moment everyone froze, counting the sound. The researcher moved, and his forearm knocked the hourglass, which toppled. It struck stone, and the neck split with a sharp, wet clatter. Dark ash and grit sprayed across the chapel floor. A shard nicked the initiate's palm, and a thin line of blood bloomed. The prophet's voice cut through the courtyard then, low at first and then rising. He had come at the sound of breaking glass. "What is this?" he demanded, and his feet stirred dust in a quick, clean rhythm. The prophet moved with a measured sway, and he raised one hand as if counting a metronome. "You have failed the hour," he said to the initiate. "You have made choice where one must accept." The initiate's shoulders slumped. "I could not," he started. "You will answer the prophet. You will show loyalty. Or you will be cut from the fold." The researcher stepped forward and named what he had found. Corbin Valen, the signed permits, the rosters that left the watch unguarded that night. He spoke plainly, and his voice did not waver. "You have staged civic cooperation," he said. "You placed an ally in town hall and removed guards. You plan to break the hourglass where the population is forced to gather." The prophet's eyes narrowed, amber glinting in the morning light. "You bring accusations. Bring evidence, then." He reached for the initiate's wrist and drew the braided cord away to inspect the ritual mark. "You would betray your own, the prophet." The initiate looked at the researcher. He trembled. "He is wrong. The initiate, I tried to stop it. I did not want the town to be used." Three voices rose at once. "Prophet, initiate, researcher." In a rapid exchange. "You lied." "The prophet, you disobeyed." "You placed a name on paper." The researcher answered. "You set the township on a list. You would judge us all." The prophet. The back and forth pulsed. Accusation, denial, demand. The acolyte moved closer, rod raised again. The prophet struck the acolyte's hand aside with his staff and did not raise his voice beyond a clipped cadence. He examined the broken neck like a craftsman. "This fracture does not finish the rite," he observed, "but it changes timing. We accelerate." The researcher watched the prophet's fingers close on the initiate's arm. He felt the prophet's authority fracture for an instant in the way the inner circle scattered. And he saw a new fact. The prophet did not plan only a single ritual. He planned a network. When the prophet turned his head, there was a wet glint beneath a fallen piece of glass. An inset panel with a paper list that had been glued into the hourglass base. They could have missed it. The initiate noticed first, stooping in pain. He fumbled at the splintered rim and drew out a narrow packet. Inside were tiny tabs of paper, each with a place name and a symbol. The researcher read aloud: "Whiteford Chapel, Market Square, Clarson Ferry, Harbour Gate, Greywell Bridge, Toll Board, Ashfield Mill, Grain Floor." His voice caught on a name he had not expected. One of the sites lay in a town 2 days' ride from here. He felt a rush of cold calculation. The ledger had been only one piece. The hourglass had contained a map of other hourglasses. Doubt snapped into clarity. This was not a single rite. It was a coordinated campaign. The initiate covered his mouth. "There are more," he whispered. He asked the hourglasses would fracture the old world into new land. "He marked every place we hold. Who else knows?" The researcher asked in a circle. "The initiate and Corbin." And he stopped, and his look darted to the prophet, who had already turned away and was counting names on his staff. The prophet's authority rebuilt itself with a slow efficiency. He did not immediately lash out. Instead, he spoke to the acolyte and to the remaining members by name. "Calibrating blame and duty, we adapt," he said. "We do not retreat. The absence of Rafer's watch compels us to quicken. Corbin will release the permits tonight. We move earlier." The researcher heard the single, alarming fact that ended the argument in that room. A shift of schedule. The network would not wait. The township would be targeted sooner than the ledger suggested. The initiate looked at him with new urgency. You must leave with the list. The initiate. You must carry it to those who enforce law, who will believe a scholar with a broken hourglass and a folded map. The researcher asked, they will if you name Corbin Valen and show the permits. The initiate, they will if you bring evidence of the watch roster. They left at dusk with the broken glass tucked into padded cloth. The researcher photographed the list of locations and then burned a copy. He would not leave a loose trail that the prophet could follow. In the urgency of the moment, he felt a change inside himself. Suspicion had pushed him to inquiry. Doubt had become fear. Fear now turned into a brittle determination to act. That internal shift showed in the way he moved short, clipped steps, notes written in ink that stained his fingers. Back at his study that night, he catalogued every item. The ledger pages, the map, Corbin's dated permit, the guard roster, and the minute slips from the hourglass base. He set each piece under a lamp and photographed them on glass plates. The initiate sat beside him and refused to sleep. He will come for us, the initiate. The prophet will not let this pass. Then we must make the town hall see us before night falls on their square. The researcher answered, we will go at first light and present the evidence. They planned with blunt precision. The researcher rehearsed the sequence of evidence. He set the ledger pages in order and labeled names. He wrote down Corbin Valen's known meetings. He plotted routes to the towns listed on the slips. He made contingency plans for witnesses. The room smelled of lamp oil and the resin from the hourglass. At 2 in the morning, a sharp rap came at the front door. The researcher froze, hand on the ledger. He did not call out. The knock returned harder. He pulled open the door an inch and peered through the crack. A single wrapped parcel lay on the step with a small crescent of bronze pressed into the twine. No footfalls, no farewell. He lifted the parcel and closed the door. Inside was a scrap of paper, brown ink spelled in neat hand. Corbin Valen will be at the council meeting at dawn. He is a man who keeps appointments. The paper had no signature. The researcher put it on top of the ledger and read the line 3 times. The chapter closed on a simple, concrete sound, the knock, and a clear new directive. The township's permit holder had a known schedule. The researcher set his spectacles, checked the list of hourglass sites again, and wrote a single line at the top of his notebook. Wake at dawn. Bring proof. Name. Corbin Valen. He snapped the lamp off, and the study settled into a black that was not emptiness, but a measured pause before movement. Emotion root. Suspicion. The feeling had guided him from the chest through the chapel and back to his desk. Emotion shifts, suspicion, doubt, fear, resolve. Every choice he made in the chapter followed those movements. He pressed the initiate because suspicion demanded evidence. He confronted Corbin because doubt required verification. He fought at the chapel because fear demanded action. And he catalogued the ledger because resolve meant preparation. The chapter ends not with a tidy answer but with a concrete step outward. A knock at the door and a morning appointment that will force the next decision. At midnight the prophet snapped the leather seal and set the hourglass on the bell's stone plinth. Suspicion tightened the researcher's jaw as he pressed his shoulder against a cold niche and counted the faces below. The bell chamber smelled of iron and old smoke. The researcher had watched rituals before. He had not seen a device timed to fling powder beyond a tower. He moved a hand to his coat where the ledger page he had recovered burned a patch through linen. The central problem sat now in the researcher's palm. The hourglass was not symbolic. It was calibrated to release a fine, airborne powder when its inner neck cleared. That meant more than sacrament. It meant engineered harm. The researcher had noted the hourglass before. In Chapter 1 he had transcribed an initiate pouring black ash into a cracked obsidian hourglass. In Chapter 2 he had pried open a rusted chest and found dark ash on flagstones and a blood, damp page. Those concrete items were evidence. They made suspicion into a tangible case. He had one advantage. He knew where to watch. He had climbed the narrow spiral without a torch. He kept his boots silent against damp stone. His notebook rested open against his thigh. He breathed shallow and counted the acolytes' murmur as if it were a metronome. The prophet spoke from the center of the circle. Bind the ropes, he said. When the sand finishes, the bell will call the cleansing. The voice was thin and confident. The prophet and acolyte echoed once and then fell silent. The initiate stood to the prophet's left, hood low, hands clenched around a braided cord. The initiate's eyes met the researcher's. The initiate did not look like a conspirator. He looked sick and determined. The researcher kept his hand on the ledger page until his knuckles whitened. He judged time by breath now. He refused to let ritual cadence substitute for scrutiny. They had brought a calibrated device into the belfry. That fact defined his options: intervene and risk exposure, or wait and collect irrefutable proof. Suspicion pushed him toward proof. He eased from his niche and slipped down a shadowed lintel toward the nave corridor. A cold wind threaded the stair. An acolyte stepped past and his sleeve brushed stone. The researcher swallowed and kept moving. He had to reach the nave corridor where the initiate might pass. The initiate's transfer came in a single, near-silent motion. The initiate slipped from the ring and walked the nave with the cadence of someone rehearsed. He passed the researcher with a folded page pressed to his chest. The researcher felt the weight of the paper against his coat. He did not look up. When the initiate's hand touched his lapel, the researcher only now. The initiate's fingers left the ledger page there, and his lips moved so faintly the researcher caught only a fragment. Targets. Dates burn after reading. The initiate's breath hitched. They separated before anyone noticed. The researcher retreated into an alcove and opened the page by candlelight. The page was cramped with ink. A coded sigil sat in the margin. A list of township names followed, each with a date and a narrow column of numbers. One line had a note in the prophet's hand: "Begin at dawn. Bell winds will spread." The page converted propaganda into plan. He read aloud under his breath, because speaking slowed thought: Northam, Eastford, Greybridge. Sunrise, 20 days. He tapped each name with his knuckle and felt the ledger's texture. Waxed patches, blood smears, a pressed grain of ash. Footsteps sounded above. The bell chamber hummed with movement. The prophet's sermon leaned into mechanical explanation. Observe the process. The prophet from above. The hourglass measures the passing. The bell measures consent. When the sand falls, the wind works with rope and cloth to carry the blessing. This is not death. It is rebirth. His hand moved toward the hourglass, and the small brass hourglass on his cord winked like a promise. An acolyte laughed once, a dry sound. The prophet knows the hours. The researcher felt a second wave of emotion, different from suspicion. It lodged in his throat as a metallic taste. He did not call it fear aloud. Instead, he folded the page, slid it into his coat, and began to move. The prophet stepped to the altar platform and tapped the larger hourglass with a forefinger. He explained the calibration out loud, naming increments and the strain of glass at a particular notch. His voice quickened into instruction. He spoke about ropes, bell pulls, and wind cloths, long swathers of treated linen set on the tower's west vents to catch gusts and carry whatever settled on them. The researcher listened for scientific points he could later present to constables. He catalogued phrases: calibrated neck, dispersal veil, sachet of fine ash. Each phrase tightened the legal frame. At the nave corridor, the researcher felt a furtive pressure. The initiate appeared, eyes propped open by a look of someone who had rehearsed betrayal. He reached out and touched the researcher's sleeve, read it. The initiate breathed, "Read and go tell Thomas." "Don't let him tell." "He Thomas, the constable by name, low and urgent. Why now?" The researcher: "Because I saw the ledger in the prophet's hand." The initiate: "Because I could not pour the ash when they ordered me. Because I do not want to die in order to start the world." The researcher's fingers tightened on the folded page. He felt doubt, then a quick surge of clarity. He had suspected fraud. Now he had names and dates. The problem was larger than a single night's theatrics. They exchanged 3 short lines before a sluice of movement above made them fall silent. "Go." The researcher: "The initiate. Find Constable Thomas. Secure witnesses. Do not return alone." The initiate hesitated, and then ducked from the nave like a shadow. He moved with more speed than his stature promised. Back in the belfry, the prophet demonstrated a small brass mechanism that fit beneath the larger hourglass. He lifted the glass and showed a narrow funnel and a silk sachet. The furnace of persuasion burned through instruction. "The wind is our hand, the prophet, the bell our mouth." He smiled in a way that left a thin seam of cruelty on his face. A senior acolyte, a broad, shouldered man with a scar along his chin, stepped forward and took up the bell rope. He did not speak. He worked the rope with method and a practiced economy of motion. The researcher chose a narrow stair to move up and down. He planned to remove the hourglass at a moment of slack. He had assessed risk. A scuffle on a spiral stair favored the defenders. He kept his hand on the thin brass pendant in his coat pocket as if it were an anchor. As he reached the platform, the prophet's voice cut across the chamber. "Watch the seal, the prophet. When it breaks, we give away what must be given." He held the hourglass and turned it slowly. The researcher reached for the hourglass. A senior acolyte intercepted his hand with a hard, veterinary precision. Metal slammed against stone. The researcher felt his shoulders strike the low wall. The senior acolyte, "Stop him." His voice carried no question. The researcher pushed back. "Let him go." The initiate shouted from a step below. "Let him go this once. The prophet decides." The senior acolyte replied. He tightened his grip on the researcher and shoved. A rapid exchange followed on the stair, 3 to 5 shoves and pulls. The researcher's hand slid. He almost lost the ledger page. The initiate lunged between them and shoved the senior acolyte against the rail. The senior acolyte staggered. "Get out!" "The senior acolyte, hold here!" The prophet's face changed when he saw the initiate move. For one breath, the prophet's expression broke into something raw. Anger folded with "Betrayal, you traitor!" The prophet, he spoke the name like a blade. The initiate stepped backward and then struck out, not with a weapon, but with the desperate sweep of palms that had no plan but to force distance. At that instant, the initiate caught the hourglass with both hands and smashed it against the altar rail. Glass exploded. The calibrated interior fractured in a single metallic sound. Fine powder blew up in a gray cloud and settled on boots, ropes, and the prophet's robes. A hunk of the hourglass, still engraved with the sigil, skittered across flagstone and struck a stray bell mechanism. The bell crashed down from its hooks as rope snapped. The sound cleaved the night's near silence. The prophet moved like a man whose plan had been physically cut from his hands. He lunged for the initiate. "You will pay!" he shouted aloud. The acolytes surged with him. Some moved to seize the initiate. Others stood and watched. A few wore expressions that betrayed hesitation. Within 2 breaths, the researcher was on his feet, gathering ledger fragments that fluttered like dark leaves. He pulled a corner free and saw a clean list of coordinates and dates. He tucked the slips into his coat and put his body between the prophet and the initiate. "Back, the researcher, back, all of you." The prophet slid between 2 acolytes and struck the researcher with a fist that landed on his jaw. The researcher tasted copper and steadied himself on a splintered plank. Acolytes wrestled. The initiate shrieked once and then went silent. The senior acolyte raised a hand, blood on his knuckles. A moment later he lowered it and stared at his own palm as if asking how loyalty had become a bruise. Outside, the village woke to the bell's crash and the echo of bodies on stone. A dog barked. Someone shouted a direction. The sound produced a new variable. The constable would arrive. Constable Thomas arrived with a lantern and a solid gait. He pushed up the tower steps and took in the collapsed hourglass, the scattered powder, the prophet's bleeding lip. His first movement was procedural. He secured the doorway. "What happened?" "Thomas." He spoke to the nearest adult voice. "The prophet explained the rite," said the senior acolyte. His voice faltered. "Show me the ledger, Thomas." He lifted a hand and the acolyte produced a soaked slip of paper from his robe. Thomas's eyes moved over names. "This is organized. This is arson and poisoning planned." His expression hardened in a way that made the prophet look small. The prophet's fingers flexed. He spat a curse and then, with a motion that kept pace with instinct, turned and fled down the tower staircase. He moved like a man carrying a private fire. A few acolytes followed to form a shield. The rest stayed, rooted by the bell's ruined fall and the fact of the ledger now lying in plain sight. The researcher gathered the largest shards of hourglass glass and wrapped them in a scrap of robe. He picked up a shard with the engraved sigil and held it under the lantern's light. It was small and bright and dangerous. The initiate sat on a low step, clutching a shoulder where the prophet had struck him. His breathing came ragged and fast. "Why?" The initiate. The name as if it were a wound. "Why would he use bell ropes to hurt people?" "Because he thinks ending is sacred," Thomas replied. He looked both at the initiate and at the researcher, "because he wants to force a change." His voice was blunt and bureaucratic. He did not offer motive as sermon. The researcher handed Thomas the ledger page. "Take this to the magistrate," he said. "Circle the names. Seal them in evidence." He kept his sentences short. He had learned to speak like a clerk when lives depended on clarity. Thomas examined the paper and then looked at the prophet's direction of flight. He slammed his lantern tight and ran down the tower stairs. The prophet escaped into the pre-dawn lane where mist sat low in ruts and manure. He moved toward a row house at the edge of town. A hooded figure stood in the alley and caught him as he passed. They spoke in clipped words. The researcher watched the exchange from a window and saw the hooded figure press a small packet into the prophet's hand. The hooded figure turned away and vanished down a service stair. The researcher could not identify the hand. Back at the belfry, the researcher assembled the ledger fragments and the shard with the engraved sigil. He counted signatures and noted a repeated initial P next to several future dates. He copied lines into his notebook with a steady hand, quiet now in the wake of motion. The initiate watched him. I wrote a note once in the ledger. The initiate? I marked a date I thought he would not see. I was wrong. He met the researcher's eyes and did not look away. An emotion shifted in the researcher then. Suspicion that had been practical slid into a tighter, personal charge. He felt responsibility like a weight under his ribs. He also felt anger. He set his jaw. You did the right thing. The researcher, you smashed it. He did not add consolation. He had learned that actions mattered more than comfort. Outside, a cart rumbled by. The sound reminded the researcher that tangible witnesses existed beyond the chapel. Farmers, market vendors, and people who would recall a bell falling down at dawn. He needed them. He left the initiate in the constable's care and went to the tower steps. There he found a woman on the bottom stair, her cloak pulled close. She had been awake by the sound and had come to investigate. The researcher, she had seen a man with a bronze ring leave the lane. A bronze ring. The researcher, he repeated the detail because small things anchored testimony. The woman nodded. Thomas returned with a magistrate's clerk and 2 townsmen. They catalogued the ledger pages under lamplight. The researcher watched them and felt the next emotional shift, from urgency to grim patience. His voice dropped into ledger tone and he began to dictate notes that would be admissible in court. They moved through formalities. Fingerprints on a shard, signatures on a seizure slip, a sworn statement from the initiate. The researcher spoke in short sentences and kept repeating place names from the ledger so they would be recorded. After the formalities, Thomas quietly, he will not die here tonight. He will slip into the marshes or into a sympathizer's house. You should not expect closure. His answer was practical, edged with a constable's fatigue. The researcher looked toward the lane where the prophet had vanished and then down at the shard. He felt a small, private anger. That someone could trade human lives for an idea and do so with instruments. The researcher packed the ledger fragments into a leather satchel and wrapped the shard in oilcloth. He did not know which would matter more to the magistrate. The list of towns or the shard with the sigil that matched the prophet's brass hourglass. Both mattered. As they prepared to descend the tower, a hand moved in the shadow and plucked a small fragment from the shattered pile on the altar. The researcher did not see who took it. He only saw the empty space where that shard had been and then a dark footstep leave the chapel. The researcher called out and people moved, but the figure had already disappeared into the early light. For a moment all hope of neat evidence waned. Then Thomas, we have enough to hold suspicion and issue a warrant. We hold the initiate's testimony. We can set watches at the roads listed. We can warn Northam and Eastford. He set a plan with the steadiness of a man who had seen disorder before. The researcher folded his hands over the satchel and counted breaths. He thought of previous nights. The initiate pouring black ash into the cracked obsidian hourglass. The rusted chest and the smear of blood on a page. Those earlier moments had been proof that preceded action. Now he would convert proof into law. He had another thought. The hooded figure who had handed the prophet a packet suggested a network. The ledger's dates suggested coordination. The missing shard suggested an inside hand. These facts changed his understanding. This was not a single cell of dangerous faith. It was the edge of a structured effort. He Thomas what he had seen at the alley and what the woman had said about a bronze ring. He emphasized names from the ledger. Thomas's face grew harder. We will dispatch riders to the named towns and alert their watchmen. Thomas, we will close the roads likely to be used at dawn. He used short, actionable sentences. The researcher left the tower in daylight that made stone look pallid. He carried the satchel and his notebook. He had at least 3 responsibilities now. Record evidence, protect the initiate, and pursue the prophet's trail. The chapter closed on one precise image. The researcher watching a dark figure cross the high street and duck into an alley, chestnut boots visible for a moment, a bronze ring flashing at a thumb. He started after that figure, ledger at his side and resolute in motion. He had not solved the cult. He had not captured the prophet. He had, however, transformed suspicion into action, and he held enough proof to force a civic response. He stepped into the lane and followed the wet footprints. The shard wrapped in oilcloth at his belt, and the names of 3 townships written twice in his mind as if to preserve them from loss. The final sound in the chapter was not rhetoric, but the measured clack of his boots on cobble and the distant shout of a rider who took the magistrate's warrant down the lane toward Northam. The prophet lifted the cracked hourglass, and the initiate poured black ash into its narrowed neck. The ash hissed against glass, and the congregation held its breath. Suspicion tightened the occult researcher's jaw as he balanced on a rafter, a leather-bound notebook pressed to his chest. He had watched ritual theater before, smoke, chanting, sleight of hand, but this morning carried a calculation in the prophet's eyes that made fraud seem too small a culprit. The central problem was immediate. Whoever controlled that hourglass could decide whether a town lived or died, and the researcher had to prove how. He moved higher, breath shallow, trying to pin a truth to the ceremony with the same methodical patience he used to catalogue marginalia in burned manuscripts. The chapel lay on a cliff edge. Wind pushed salt and grit through shattered stained glass. The prophet, robe hems flicking with sea spray, recited a cadence that the initiate answered in a thin voice. The congregation, 20 men and women from the township, plus robed acolytes, formed a ring around the altar. The researcher watched their hands. Knuckles white, fingers smeared with candle wax and ash. He slowed his breathing and counted syllables, noting cadence and pause as evidence. He had come here to map belief onto artifact, and suspicion was the engine that would make him climb down to the floor and intervene. He dropped from the rafter into rafter's beams and crouched behind a loose pew board. He listened for a ledger, for a glint of metal, for any sign that this morning was theater. A single line of the prophet's voice cut across the chant. We do not merely pray, we welcome the unmaking. The researcher heard it as a claim and a threat. He tightened his fingers around his brass pendant, feeling its edges, and crawled toward the drapery behind the altar, where his previous search had turned up a rusted chest. The memory of a folded page damp with old blood, the ledger entry from the earlier chest, pulled him forward. He would not be content with accusation. He needed the ledger, the hourglass, and whatever lay inside it. The first surprise came before he touched the fabric. A thin beam of dawn caught a hidden seam, and the researcher found a hairline slit in the altar cloth. He forced his hand into a pocket behind the wood and felt parchment. He withdrew a ledger, smaller than the map he had found in the rusted chest but bound in the same dark hide, and a metal tube the size of his thumb. He did not yet look at the ink. Suspecting forgery had got him into the chapel. The ledger's presence made suspicion mutate into a different shape. Curiosity edged with alarm. He pressed the ledger beneath his coat, and with one final check of the rafters, climbed down toward the nave. At the altar rim the initiate stalled with the ash at the hourglass lip. The researcher watched the initiate's hands shake. The initiate's face, olive skin and heart-shaped jaw was slick with sweat. The prophet stepped close, voice low. "Do it, Marek," he said. "Do it for the cleansing." The initiate's voice trembled. He glanced at the researcher, not yet aware of the hidden figure beneath the beams. "He can't see." The prophet smiled without warmth. "Marek, you have seen enough." Marek swallowed and let the ash fall. It made a soft, sour smell in the chapel when it struck the hourglass, like old smoke and iron. The congregation inhaled as one. The researcher took 2 steps forward, feeling the floorboards register his weight. He had meant to stay hidden longer, to collect more evidence. Suspicion had shifted to oppressed urgency, the possibility that the hourglass contained something other than trickery. He stepped down into the nave and held the ledger up. "Stop," said the researcher. His voice was low, archival, but loud enough everyone turned. The prophet's eyes narrowed. "You are not welcome here, stranger," the prophet in a rasp that gathered the room's attention. The researcher unfolded the ledger and showed a page inked in cramped hand. "This ledger records deaths. Your ledger calls them rites." He set the page on the altar rim so sunlight pinned the letters. The congregation leaned in. Murmurs sparked like tinder. "How dare bring your papers among us," an acolyte said and reached for the tome. "Lock him." The prophet lifted a hand. "He is the one who reads. Let him speak." His tone cut across the shouts like a blade. "Tell them what you saw, stranger." The prophet, the researcher, met the prophet's gaze. "You call this salvation, but these are records of targeting. Page after page lists houses, names, the dates the bell last tolled before the fall. You mask murder as mercy." The prophet's mouth twitched. "Name one entry and we will answer." The researcher scanned and named one. "Marin of West Row. Sealed April 3. His finger hesitated where ink had been smudged and a fleck of dried blood clung to the margin. A woman in the crowd gasped. Someone clutched their throat. "Marin of West Row is recorded as a deliberate offering." An old man shouted, "Marin was a drunk! He burned the barn himself." His voice carried the strain of grief seeking justification. Another voice said, "Marin cursed the prophet last harvest." Arguments flared, short and raw. The researcher watched the prophet tilt his head, the way ritual leaders read a reaction and turned it into doctrine. "Read me this," the prophet to the crowd. "Read their names and hear them choose." He leaned close to Marek and whispered, and Marek's jaw clenched. The researcher could see Marek's fingers shake as he closed the hourglass and turned his face away. Marek's hesitation had not gone unnoticed. The prophet used it to assert control. The researcher moved to the sacristy while the debate swelled. He had to know whether the hourglass contained talismanic bone or trick glass. Behind the altar drapery he knelt and pried at the hourglass stand. His hand brushed a seam, and then a compartment popped open beneath the hourglass base. He felt a cold, granular dust on his fingertips, bone ground to powder, and a small pendant the size of a coin engraved with a sigil. The pendant thrummed faintly under his skin like a pulse. The researcher nearly dropped the relic. He carried the pendant into the nave and set it on the ledger page. "This is not theater," he said. "This is a device." The prophet leaned down. "Device or sacrament? You cannot see the difference." The researcher thumbed the pendant and felt a hum in his teeth, a vibration in the bone of his jaw. He felt no visions. He felt a ripple in the air over the sacristy door, and a villager in the back pitched forward, seizing at his chest. People began to cough, then to howl with private images, crossing their faces as if they tasted salt and iron, and then laughter. A few collapsed. Panic narrowed the congregation's attention. Hands reached for weapons. People called names. "The cursed thing," someone said. "Take it away." The prophet's voice rose above the noise. "It is working. It calls them home." He smiled in a way the researcher had seen in a leader who maintained control by reframing evidence. "Do you still accuse us of murder, stranger?" the prophet. "Or will you admit what you cannot bear to see?" There was a rupture in the crowd. The old man who had defended Marin leaned toward the prophet with his jaw set. "You promised safety. We gave you children." The prophet placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "We promised release. We promised rebirth." He tapped the hourglass. "You will choose." An acolyte grabbed a cleaver from a wall rack. Another pulled a rope from their belt. The chapel changed shape from courtroom to battlefield in 2 breaths. The researcher felt the ledger's paper under his fingers and knew he had to act now. He did not have proof to explain the pendant's mechanism, only the object and the way it affected bodies. He shifted his emotional current. Suspicion to fear, then fear to decision. He spoke, and his voice flew over the new anger. "Listen to me. Marek, look at the ledger. See the dates." Marek hesitated. "It is God's will," he whispered, as if repeating a line he had learned at someone's instruction. "It is the end. You open the ledger," the researcher. "Find Marin." Marek fumbled, pages trembling between his fingers. The prophet stepped forward. "Do not," the prophet warned. "Do not break what we have bound." There was a rapid exchange. 3 acolytes lunged to seal the sacristy. Townspeople moved to block the altar steps. In 3 short lines of argument, the researcher and the prophet clashed over control. "Let him show the names," the old man shouted. "Let us see the truth." "You will not quench what has begun," the prophet. "You will not steal our hour." Marek flipped the ledger open with fingers that trembled. The researcher pointed with a steady hand, page 26. Marin of West Row. Note the seal marked by you, Prophet. The room's noise strangled to a thin wire of attention. Marek's eyes tracked to a faded symbol in the margin and then widened. You marked him as necessary, the old man said. You wrote the date. No, whispered Marek. He did not. He stopped as the Prophet's hand closed on his wrist. The Prophet's fingers left a bruise where ritual burns showed. Marek's face went slack with something like resignation. The researcher shoved his hand under the Prophet's robe and produced the metal tube he had pried free from the ledger's leather lining earlier. He held it up. This is a cartridge, this is not worship, it is a vector. The Prophet's laugh did not reach his eyes. Name a vector, doctor, name your science. Before the researcher could answer, the pendant on the altar flashed with living light, not a metaphorical flash. A brief, visible shimmer that crawled along the carved sigil and pulsed outward in a thin spray. A woman 2 rows back screamed and clawed at her face. The air filled with a metallic taste. Several people slumped to the floor, trembling. A boy staggered and ran for the nave doors. That instant was the mid-chapter cliffhanger, the pendant's shimmer and the sudden, spreading physical collapse. Every 3-5 paragraphs before, an external event had occurred. This one shifted the argument from ledger and motive to consequence and immediate danger. The researcher had to decide whether to break the hourglass and risk the ritual's acceleration, or to try to sequester the relic and save those still standing. He chose motion over paralysis. He lunged for the hourglass base. The Prophet reached for it at the same time. They collided. Hands grappled over glass. Marek pulled back as if to flee, then froze with a sound between sob and oath. The room broke into fast dialogue, shouts of stop. Hold him. Kill the stranger! The researcher felt the shift of room weight as zeal turned to violence. They closed on the hourglass. The Prophet's grip left a rip in the researcher's scholar's coat. The hourglass tilted and the glass split. Powder burst out like a hush of ash. It tasted of iron and cold salt when the researcher inhaled. A flash of odor, a pressure in the skull. For a second the world condensed into staccato images. The Prophet's amber eyes dilating with triumph. Marek's hand going to his throat. The initiate's mouth, forming a word the researcher couldn't catch. Then the visions hit. The faithful collapsed into ecstatic convulsions, clutching at each other and smiling through blood in ways that made the researcher flinch. Some laughed, some wept, a child screamed. The pendant rolled under a pew and thudded against a boot. The ash spread like a grey tide across the marble. The researcher tasted iron and heard a bell tolling inside his head, though the tower bell had not moved. He pressed his mouth against his wrist to stop himself from inhaling more and grabbed a shard of glass. He jammed it into the hourglass neck to stanch the flow. Marek was sobbing now, tangled in a rope of his own hand. The Prophet shouted a phrase that sounded like a prayer and then a drill. You will not use theft to accuse us, the Prophet called. You will not take our path. A swarm of townspeople surged forward. 2 grabbed the researcher and pinned his arms. Another lifted Marek by the shoulders until his feet left the floor. The initiate's eyes had gone white at the edges. His hands were stained with ash, and he laughed without humor. The researcher felt the ledger slip from his coat as someone knocked him sideways. A page unfurled across the floor and a list of names rolled into the light. Look! Someone cried. They marked more than the poor. The old man who had defended Marin picked up a knife and ran for the Prophet. He cried, "You used us as a blade!" The Prophet stepped back, staff raised. For 3 breaths the chapel's momentum teetered between a lynching and a parley. The researcher, pinned, saw an avenue. If Marek could be shaken free from the Prophet's cadence, he might reverse the crowd's momentum. Look at him, the researcher, forcing his voice through a mouthful of dust. Marek, look at your hands, open them. Marek's fingers were black with ash. He stared at them like a stranger. He wanted to belong, he whispered. He wanted to belong. Read the names now, urged the researcher. Read them aloud and say why you signed. Marek coughed, then, voice small, read 1 line. Marin of West Row, marked as necessary. He looked at the Prophet. You taught me to write the dates. The Prophet advanced. You will not betray me for fear of death, he said. He lifted his staff and the acolytes tightened their grips. Words became blows. The old man lunged. The prophet's staff struck wood against wood, and the staff's carved bone splintered on a bench, a short back, and fourth argument exploded into punching and pushing. 5 rapid lines of trade. Stop him! Hold the prophet! Get the hourglass. We are losing people. Passed through the crowd. The researcher twisted free and shoved the ledger under a bench to protect it from trampling. He saw the pendant slip toward the nave and dove for it. He grabbed the pendant and felt the same hum as before. The hum tunneled into his molars. He forced his thumb down on the engraved sigil and felt it yield under pressure like warm wax. For an instant he saw a clear image. A map of the town with crosses at houses, and a note in a hand he recognized from past marginalia: preferred path. Minimize resistance. The image lasted like a camera flash and then receded. He realized the device stored encoded plans and a ritual key. The twist changed everything. The Order had not simply believed in destruction. It had coordinated it. He rose and shouted, "This is not prophecy. This is planning." The prophet struck at him then, and the pendant flew from the researcher's hand. It skidded across stone and landed near the fallen bell rope. The prophet kicked it under the bench where 2 townspeople knelt. The researcher surged, then stopped when he saw the initiate step between him and the prophet, hands raised. "Marek," the initiate breathed, voice rag. "Stop." The researcher recognized the initiate's voice. This was the young acolyte who had first poured ash weeks before. He had been eager in earlier observations, eyes bright at ritual. Now his face was hollow with shame. The prophet barked a laugh. "Do you see, Marek? You will shield me in the end." He reached toward the initiate and Marek moved as if to strike. The initiate pushed back, palms flat, and said, "He will not help you hurt them." There were 3 rapid exchanges of dialogue, 2 lines from the prophet, 3 defensive lines from the initiate, then a cry from the researcher. The initiate made a choice that shifted the room's balance. He stepped between the prophet and the pendant and, in a single motion, grabbed the hourglass shard the researcher had held earlier and slammed it into the base of the hourglass where the main crack had been. Glass splintered rather than ceiling. A sudden plume of ash burst outward, pelting faces, but the act broke the prophet's hold on the ritual form. The crowd reeled. Some stumbled back and coughed. Others sat down stunned. Violence had been close, and now it receded like a tide withdrawing. The prophet stood in the altar's light, his robes ragged at the hem, amber eyes burning. He looked not like a leader stripped bare, but like a man cataloging loss. He strode to the altar and lifted his staff. "If you will not follow," he said, "then you will see the difference between honesty and cowardice." He brought the staff down toward the bell rope. The old man lunged for the rope, and the altar bell began to swing. Its sound was a harsh, wet crack that echoed across the cliff. People sobbed. The researcher, gasping for air, caught Marek's eye. Marek's hand clutched the initiate's sleeve like a lifeline. In 3 short exchanges they argued without words, hand squeezes, faces turned away, a desperate negotiation without rhetoric. The prophet pulled the bell rope. Stone vibrated. The air tasted of metal. The researcher saw the prophet's face as if through a lens. Ritual burns, tattooed sigils, the thin scar left by a former life. For a second the researcher thought he could read the prophet's conviction as a ledger of loss. What he had given up to reach this point. Then the bell's sound ended and people collapsed, some from exhaustion, some from the lingering effect of ash. The prophet staggered and then, with a smooth, practiced motion, reached for the half-burned hourglass outside where a sliver still smoldered. The immediate aftermath was chaotic and concrete. The researcher photographed ledger fragments, pockets a shard of glass, and wrapped the pendant in his scarf. He tended to a woman who coughed up blood into a cloth. He watched the initiate slow his breathing and then walk toward the chapel doors. The initiate paused at the arch and turned his head once to look at the cliff ridge. He did not look toward the town. He kept moving until he was gone. The researcher walked to the open courtyard and buried the broken base of the hourglass in sand, tamping it down with his boot. He sealed the ledger's remaining pages into a small trunk and hammered the lid closed. He stamped a leather strip around the trunk and sketched the symbol of the order into its corner. He was methodical even when he felt blood on his hands. He had to create a record that others could read and verify. At dusk he laid the half-burned hourglass in a shallow pit beyond the chapel and covered it with earth. then with stones. A gull cried as he worked. The initiate passed at a distance on the cliff path and did not look back. The researcher watched the initiate's shoulders until he vanished between outcrops. The next morning, the township council assembled under a grey sky. They debated the ledger and the events in the chapel with voices that tried to hold steady. The researcher read passages aloud and named dates and names. Townspeople argued. Some demanded the prophet's arrest. Others, shaken into superstition, asked for protection rights. The researcher recorded every vote and every shouted claim, binding the civic record to the evidence he had sealed. The prophet did not leave. He stood at the chapel threshold with a bandage on his hand and the bronze staff under his arm. He watched the researcher and, for the first time, spoke without ritual cadence. "You have buried things, stranger, the prophet. You have sealed what we held as proof. You used their fear to write choices that suited you, the researcher. You planned the routes, you taught them to mark names, and you made theirs a sacrament." "The names were already there," the prophet replied. "We only read them. You wrote them, Jeras." The researcher used the prophet's given name because naming breaks charismatic distance. "You marked Marin. You set dates. Your ledger matches patterns in 3 other towns." The prophet's hand tightened on the staff. "Then judge us," he said. "But know this. The people who came to us wanted an end. We only showed them how to choose it. Then we will need witnesses and courts, not psalms," the researcher answered. The council voted to detain the prophet. He surrendered without display. He sat on the chapel steps and let 2 townsmen bind his wrists with rope. Marek returned before the sun set, hollow-eyed, and clasped the researcher's hand in both of his. He wrote them, "Marek, I thought it would save me." He began to name other entries, the researcher writing them down, each name a proof and an indictment. By night the chapel smelled of damp wood and burned wax. The researcher sealed the ledger in a trunk marked with his notes. He placed the pendant inside a metal case and locked it. He recorded the sequence. Discovery, ledger, pendant shattering, spread intervention. He catalogued every wound and every witness statement. He felt suspicion evolve into something like responsibility. He had uncovered a mechanism and now had to see it prosecuted or contained. In the hours before dawn he walked to the cliff and watched the sea. He placed the shard from the hourglass in his palm and felt the weight of what it represented. Not prophecy but organization, not mystical inevitability but engineered ritual. He tucked the shard into his coat and walked back to the chapel yard where the initiate had camped for the night. Marek sat on a low wall and traced the initials carved into it. "Marek, the researcher, you have a choice to make tomorrow in court. Will you tell them how the marks were placed?" Marek's voice was thin. "He will tell," he said, "but I am afraid of what they will do to us all." The researcher nodded and did not offer comfort. He only recorded the answer. The next day, courts convened, testimony stacked. The prophet's ritual burns were read alongside ledger entries. Witness statements matched dates. The twist revealed earlier, the pendant's encoded map and notes, meant the order had coordinated actions across a region. The council moved slowly and awkwardly, but decisively. The prophet was held for trial. A handful of acolytes fled and were pursued. Marek testified. The initiate, whose name the researcher had learned as Ilya, stood in a witness circle and described the mechanics of the hourglass and the writing rituals. The town took witness statements and burned the remaining hourglasses. When trial ended, there was no triumphant epiphany. There were broken families, the smell of burned clay, and the distant sound of a ship's bell. The researcher boxed the ledger, the pendant, and the shard and labeled the packages with dates and names. He handed them to the council and to 2 magistrates who promised to send copies to the provincial court. He left the chapel a second time with the weight of evidence behind him and the memory of how close the town had come to being remade. On the cliff he found Ilya, the initiate, standing at the lip and watching smoke rise from chimneys. Ilya's shoulders trembled with exhaustion and grief. He wanted to believe I would be reborn. You did what you could, the researcher answered, speaking without ritual cadence. He handed Ilya a wrapped parcel. A page from the ledger he had copied for safe keeping. "Keep this. If you speak again, keep to facts." Ilya took the paper and folded it into his palm like a talisman he did not understand. He stepped back from the cliff and then walked inland toward the town. He did not look over his shoulder. The researcher stood alone before dusk and unburied the half-burned hourglass to reclaim the shard he had hidden earlier. He pressed the shard into his palm and watched the light shrink inside it. He had resolved the immediate threat. The ledger would be used at trial, the prophet would answer for his acts, and the Order's network might be uncovered. Yet a residual dread remained, the knowledge that a device could steer people toward destruction when combined with rhetorical authority. That knowledge would not leave with the magistrate's seal. He slid the shard into his pack and walked away from the cliff. As he passed the chapel gate, he saw the prophet led toward a guard wagon, head held high. Merrick walked a short distance behind him, shoulders bent but steady. The researcher kept walking until dusk thickened and then stopped, set his pack down, and wrote a final note in his ledger. Sealed items, ledger pendant, shard. Witnesses, Aliyah, Marin family, council action taken, trial pending, recommendation, provincial oversight, catalogue for containment. He closed the book and slid the pen into his coat. The last concrete event of the chapter came as a sound, a single sharp knock on the council door. He turned, saw two magistrates exchange a glance, and then walked toward the meeting house. The knock meant the provincial courier had arrived with the first official form for transfer. The chapter ended on that action. A movement toward formal accountability and the slow, necessary work of turning a violent doctrine into evidence that could be used to prevent repetition. He walked inside to hand the forms over, and the door closed behind him. A half-burned shard of glass slid into his palm as he set the sealed packages on the table, and the initiate left for the cliffs without a backward glance.